My name is Scott Sanders. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my life, I've been what people call steady. Not loud, not dramatic. I'm the person others describe as dependable, the one who shows up early, handles things without being asked, and doesn't make a scene about it. Most of the time, my presence doesn't create noise. I've grown used to being underestimated, but not in an obvious way. No one insults me outright. It's subtler than that. People assume I'll agree, that I'll carry the extra weight, that I'll be there to fill in the gaps when something is forgotten or avoided. When you stay calm long enough, people start confusing composure with weakness. When you stay quiet long enough, they assume you don't have boundaries. This isn't a revenge story. It isn't about confrontation or emotional outbursts. There are no shouting matches here, no dramatic turning points meant to humiliate anyone. What happened to me unfolded slowly, quietly, so gradually that most people didn't realize anything was changing until it was already irreversible. For years, I lived inside a role that was never formally assigned but fully expected. The responsible son, the reliable one, the person who would take care of it. I handled the things no one else wanted to think about. I paid attention to details others ignored. I told myself that this was just adulthood, that family meant sacrifice, that doing the right thing didn't require recognition. But silence, repeated often enough, becomes precedent, and precedent turns into entitlement, usually for the people who benefit from your effort, not for the person providing it. At the center of this story is a house tied to family history, unspoken assumptions, and a long chain of quiet expectations. For years, I paid the property taxes on that house. Consistently. On time. Without conditions. I never used it as leverage. I never announced it. I genuinely believed I was doing the responsible thing. Until one day, the buyer showed up with keys, before anyone even called me. That moment didn't make me angry. It made it clear. What followed wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It was deliberate. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask to be acknowledged. I simply stopped holding up a structure that had never truly acknowledged me. I let things function exactly as they would when a silent load-bearing piece is removed. I'm not telling this story to paint anyone as a villain. Most people operate within the logic that serves them, until that logic collapses. I'm telling it because many of us quietly carry responsibilities that go unseen, uncredited, and eventually assumed. If you've ever wondered where the line is between being supportive and being taken for granted, you may recognize yourself in what comes next. Before we continue, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever stayed silent not because you had nothing to say, but because you weren't sure anyone was truly listening? To understand what happened later, you have to understand who I was before anything went wrong. To my parents, I was the responsible one. Not the emotional one, not the difficult one. I wasn't the child who needed managing or reassurance. I was the one they didn't worry about. And for a long time, I took that as a compliment. I was the son who handled things quietly. Paperwork, deadlines, bills that needed attention. I didn't announce when I took something on. I just did it. Somewhere along the way, my reliability stopped being appreciated and started being assumed. When family decisions were discussed, my role was rarely central. I was informed, not consulted, included, but not essential. People spoke around me, not to me. And because I didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't demand clarity, everyone concluded I was fine with that arrangement. I told myself I was choosing peace. From the outside, my life probably looked uncomplicated. I had a stable job. I didn't ask for help. I didn't create friction. If something needed fixing, I fixed it. If something needed paying, I paid it. I never framed these things as sacrifices. I framed them as responsibilities. That framing mattered because it allowed everyone else to forget there was a cost. The house was already part of this dynamic long before it became the center of the story. It was talked about in vague, sentimental terms. The family house. Something we'll deal with later. No one ever sat down and laid out roles, rights, or expectations, and I never asked them to. When the property taxes first came up, it wasn't dramatic, just a conversation that drifted in my direction, a mention of timing, a concern about cash flow. I said I could handle it, not because I was asked directly, but because that's what I always did. I stepped in where things felt uncertain. After that, it became routine, year after year. No reminder needed, no acknowledgement required. The payments went out, the house stayed in good standing, and slowly, quietly, that responsibility attached itself to me without attaching any authority along with it. What's strange is how invisible steady effort becomes when it doesn't come with noise. No one checked in to ask how I felt about it. No one clarified what it meant long term. And I didn't volunteer those questions because I didn't want to complicate things. I didn't want to seem difficult. I didn't want to disrupt the version of me they were comfortable with. So I stayed in my lane. In family conversations, I listened more than I spoke. When plans were discussed, I nodded. When decisions were hinted at, I assumed I'd be looped in if it mattered. I trusted that my consistency earned me consideration, even if it wasn't verbalized. That trust was misplaced, but at the time it didn't feel naive. It felt mature. I wasn't invisible because people disliked me. I was invisible because I made things easier. And when someone makes your life easier without complaint, you stop seeing the effort. You start seeing it as part of the background. Like electricity, you only notice it when it's gone. Back then, I didn't think of myself as overlooked. I thought of myself as dependable. I believed that doing the right thing, consistently, would eventually be reflected back to me in respect or inclusion. What I didn't understand yet was this. People don't reevaluate a system that works for them. They don't question arrangements that benefit them quietly. And they rarely imagine that the person holding everything together might one day decide to stop. At that point in my life, I hadn't stopped anything. I hadn't even considered it. I was still playing the role as written, reliable, useful, calm, and silent. I didn't know yet that this role came with an expiration date. The first moment I remember clearly didn't feel important at the time. That's the thing about small cuts. You don't stop what you're doing when they happen. You barely notice the sting. You just keep moving. It was a casual conversation. Nothing heated. No raised voices. We were talking about the house in passing, the way my family always did. Half logistical, half nostalgic. Someone mentioned a potential change down the line. Not a decision, just an idea, a possibility. I listened. As they talked, I realized something strange. They were speaking as if I wasn't part of the equation at all. Not just emotionally, structurally, as if my role ended at maintenance, as if my involvement stopped at keeping things afloat, not having a say in where things were headed. No one looked at me when the comment was made. No one checked my reaction. The conversation simply flowed past me, like I was a piece of furniture in the room. I remember thinking, that's odd, and then immediately dismissing the thought. I told myself I was overthinking it, that it wasn't finalized, that of course I'd be included if anything real happened. This was family, after all. We didn't need formalities, we trusted each other. That's what I told myself. A few weeks later, there was another moment, slightly sharper. Someone joked, lightly, about how Scott's got it covered anyway. It got a small laugh, not unkind, not malicious, just casual. That laugh landed differently. Not because it was cruel, but because it revealed something. The expectation wasn't that I would help if needed. It was that I already belonged to that function. Like gravity, like plumbing. Something reliable that didn't need to be acknowledged. I smiled. I let it pass. I didn't correct anyone. I was good at that. Around me, no one noticed anything off. From their perspective, nothing had changed. The system was working. Bills were paid. Tension was low. The responsible son was still responsible. Inside, though, I started noticing patterns I'd ignored before. How discussions happened without me, then conclusions were relayed afterward. How my contributions were referenced indirectly, never addressed directly. How decisions drifted closer and closer to permanence while my role remained temporary and undefined. Each instance on its own was easy to excuse. Together, they formed something harder to ignore. Still, I didn't speak up. I told myself timing mattered, that raising concerns too early would seem paranoid, that I didn't want to inject conflict where there wasn't any. Yet. I believed restraint was maturity. What I didn't realize was that restraint, when unreciprocated, becomes permission. The first small cut wasn't an action. It was an omission. The absence of a pause. The absence of a question. No one said, "Scott, what do you think?" And because I didn't demand that space, it quietly closed. I continued paying the property taxes. On time. Automatically. The habit was so ingrained I barely thought about it. In my mind, consistency was still a form of integrity. I hadn't connected integrity with self-protection yet. The world around me didn't change. My job stayed steady. My parents stayed cordial. Family gatherings stayed polite. If anything, things felt smoother than ever. That's what made the cut dangerous. When everything appears calm, you assume nothing is wrong. When you're not openly disrespected, you assume respect is implied. When you're useful, you assume you're valued. I didn't yet understand the difference. That first moment, the one I brushed off, wasn't the beginning of betrayal. It was the beginning of normalization. A tiny adjustment in how people related to me, made possible because I allowed it to pass without friction. Looking back now, I can see it clearly. The shift wasn't in how they treated me. It was in what they stopped checking. And once people stop checking with you, they start deciding for you. At the time, I still believed silence was neutral. I still believed patience would eventually be rewarded. I still believed that being steady meant being safe. I didn't know yet that I just accepted the first term of an unspoken agreement, one that only benefited everyone else. Once something goes unchallenged, it doesn't stay isolated. It spreads, quietly, predictably. After that first small cut, nothing dramatic happened. No announcements, no turning points, just a series of ordinary moments that began to stack on top of each other, each one reinforcing the last. The pattern didn't announce itself. It settled in. Conversations about the house became more frequent, but less specific, at least where I was concerned. Plans were mentioned in abstract terms. We've been thinking, it might make sense to, always plural, always vague, and always spoken as if the outcome was already leaning in a certain direction. I was present but not positioned. When I did speak, my words were acknowledged politely and then set aside. Not argued with, not debated, just absorbed and bypassed. That kind of dismissal is easy to miss because it doesn't create conflict. It creates distance. And distance feels peaceful until you realize it's permanent. I kept telling myself I was choosing the higher road, that I didn't need to assert myself because the facts spoke for themselves. I was paying the taxes. I was keeping records. I was doing what needed to be done. Surely that counted for something. What I didn't want to admit was that I was afraid of disrupting the image everyone had of me. Being the easy one had advantages. I wasn't pressured. I wasn't monitored. No one questioned my choices. But there was a trade-off I hadn't calculated yet. The easier I made things for others, the easier it became to exclude me from decisions that mattered. Disrespect, when it's quiet, rarely feels like disrespect in the moment. It feels like an inconvenience, like being slightly overlooked, like a minor social misalignment you assume will correct itself. So I rationalized. I told myself my parents were just thinking out loud, that nothing was finalized, that they were under stress and didn't mean anything by it. I reminded myself that families aren't corporations. We don't need contracts. We trust each other. That trust was one-directional, but I wasn't ready to see it. The payments continued. The paperwork stayed organized. The folder on my desk grew thicker every year. Receipts, statements, confirmations. Not because I was preparing for a fight, because that's how my mind worked. I liked the order. Documentation gave me peace. I didn't realize I was building something else at the same time. At family gatherings, the tone shifted in subtle ways. Comments became more declarative, less tentative. Someone would say, "when we sell," instead of "if we sell." Another would nod, and the conversation would move on. No one looked at me. Each time it happened, a small part of me registered it. And each time I chose not to respond. I told myself I didn't want to derail the moment. I didn't want to seem territorial. I didn't want to turn a casual conversation into a confrontation. So I stayed quiet. Over time, that quiet became expected. Silence, repeated often enough, teaches people how to treat you. Not because they're malicious, but because humans are efficient. We follow the paths of least resistance. We rely on what doesn't push back. I had become the most reliable path in the room. What I didn't see yet was that I was helping normalize a version of reality where my contribution was separate from my voice, where my responsibility existed without authority, where my effort was appreciated only insofar as it remained invisible. There was no single moment where I thought, "this is wrong." There were dozens of moments where I thought, "this isn't worth addressing." That distinction matters, because when you repeatedly decide something isn't worth addressing, you're making a larger decision without realizing it. You're deciding what kind of treatment you'll accept. You're setting terms, silently. I still believed things would balance out naturally, that at some point someone would pause and say, "wait, Scott's been handling this, we should talk to him." That pause never came. By the time I noticed how far the normalization had gone, it felt too late to interrupt without seeming reactive, without looking like I was suddenly changing the rules. And I hated the idea of being seen that way. So I stayed consistent, reliable, useful, calm. From the outside, I was the same Scott I'd always been. On the inside, I was slowly realizing that my silence hadn't preserved harmony. It had trained everyone around me to move forward without me. There's a moment when you stop feeling confused and start feeling positioned. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but unmistakably. That's when you realize you're no longer just part of the situation, you're part of the system. By the time I reached that moment, the role had already been written. I was the reliable one, the logistics person, the financial backstop, the man who handled responsibilities so others didn't have to sit with discomfort. I wasn't consulted because, in their minds, consultation wasn't necessary. I was already doing my part. And my part, I realized, didn't include decision-making. No one sat me down and said this out loud. No one needed to. The expectations were clear in how conversations unfolded. I was looped in after decisions were emotionally settled. I was informed once directions were already chosen. My job wasn't to influence outcomes, it was to make outcomes easier. That realization didn't hurt all at once. It settled in gradually, like pressure you don't notice until you try to move. I started replaying old interactions in my head, noticing details I'd overlooked before. How often I was thanked for helping, rather than acknowledged for contributing. How my input was framed as support, not a stakeholder. How people assumed I'd adapt to changes rather than participate in shaping them. I wasn't being disrespected in a loud way. I was being categorized. That's the dangerous part about being dependable. People stop seeing you as a person with preferences and limits. They start seeing you as a function. And functions don't get consulted, they get used. The house was the clearest example. It existed in conversations as something emotional and abstract for everyone else. For me, it was concrete. Numbers, deadlines, documents, responsibility. But despite that, my relationship to it was treated as temporary and transactional. I was the caretaker, not the stakeholder. I noticed how often phrases like "we'll handle that" were used, without specifying who "we" was. How decisions were framed as collective, while authority remained vague. How my silence was interpreted as approval, not restraint. And I let it happen, because I didn't want to disrupt the image I'd built. That image mattered more to me than I wanted to admit. Being seen as calm, stable, unproblematic, it had become part of my identity. Challenging my role felt like challenging who I was allowed to be in that family. So instead of pushing back, I adapted. I took on more quietly. I anticipated needs. I made sure there were no loose ends. I told myself that if I stayed consistent, things would eventually align. That recognition would come naturally. What I didn't understand then was that roles don't dissolve on their own. They solidify. Every time I absorbed responsibility without asserting agency, I reinforced the assignment. Every time I chose smoothness over clarity, I confirmed their assumptions. I wasn't just being placed into a role, I was maintaining it. The uncomfortable truth was this: no one had forced me into that position. I had stepped into it repeatedly, believing it was temporary, believing it was virtuous, believing it was the right thing to do. By the time I fully recognized the role, it was already benefiting everyone else too much for them to question it. I remember sitting alone one evening, reviewing my records like I always did, and feeling something shift, not anger, not resentment, but awareness. I saw clearly the outline of the box I'd been operating inside. Reliable, useful, invisible. That wasn't how they described me, it was how they used me. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding for years. What happens if I stop playing this role? I didn't know the answer yet. I just knew the role itself was no longer neutral. It was shaping outcomes without my consent. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The day something shifted wasn't loud. There was no argument, no accusation, no sudden revelation delivered in a dramatic sentence. In fact, if you'd been watching from the outside, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything at all. That's how internal turning points usually work. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was sitting at my desk, going through documents the way I always did. Methodical, familiar, almost automatic. Receipts, statements, old emails. The same routine I'd followed for years. Not because I expected anything to go wrong, but because order made me feel grounded. I remember pausing over one document longer than usual. A property tax statement, one of many. The numbers weren't new. The dates weren't surprising. What stopped me was the realization that this stack of paper represented something no one had ever fully acknowledged. Not financially, structurally. I had been treating these payments like contributions, like support, like something that existed outside of power dynamics. But in reality, they were evidence. Proof of consistency, proof of responsibility, proof of involvement that went far beyond what anyone casually recognized. And yet, despite all that, my position in conversations hadn't shifted at all. That disconnect landed quietly but firmly. I wasn't upset, I wasn't indignant, I was recalibrating. I leaned back in my chair and asked myself a question I'd avoided for a long time. If I stopped doing this tomorrow, what would actually happen? The answer wasn't comforting. There would be confusion, scrambling, a sudden awareness of details no one had bothered to track. The system would strain, not because anyone was malicious, but because it had been built around my silent participation. That was the moment I understood something important. My value had been embedded into the structure, not acknowledged in the relationship. And structures don't express gratitude. They only react when something fails. I didn't feel angry about that. I felt clear. For years, I'd believed that staying quiet kept things stable, that silence was a form of generosity. Not asserting myself was a way of preserving peace, but in that moment, I saw the cost of that belief with uncomfortable clarity. Peace, when it only flows one way, isn't peace. It's maintenance. I looked at my phone. No messages, no check-ins, no updates. No sense that anyone felt the need to loop me into discussions about something I was materially sustaining. That absence mattered more than any harsh words could have. I realized then that nothing was going to change on its own. Not because people were cruel, but because the arrangement worked. For them. And as long as it worked, there was no incentive to examine it. That realization didn't push me toward confrontation. It did the opposite. It pushed me inward. I stopped asking myself how to be more understanding, more patient, more accommodating. I started asking a different set of questions. What do I actually control? What am I responsible for by choice? And what have I been carrying by default? Those questions didn't demand immediate answers. They demanded honesty. For the rest of that day, I didn't make any calls. I didn't send any emails. I didn't announce any realizations. I went about my routine exactly as I always had. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer operating on autopilot. That night, I slept differently. Not restlessly, intentionally. Like someone who had finally acknowledged the rules of a game they'd been playing without realizing it. The shift wasn't about anger or resolve. It was about awareness. Once you see the system clearly, you stop personalizing its outcomes. You stop asking for fairness from people who are simply following incentives you helped create. I didn't know yet what I would do with this clarity. I just knew I wouldn't unsee it. From that day forward, my silence wasn't reflexive anymore. It was deliberate, observational, strategic, even if I didn't yet call it that. The day something shifted wasn't when I decided to act. It was when I stopped assuming that inaction was neutral. After that day, nothing on the surface changed, and that was intentional. I didn't announce a boundary. I didn't confront anyone with a list of grievances. I didn't suddenly start asking pointed questions or demanding clarity. From the outside, I was the same Scott I'd always been. Calm, reliable, easy to be around. But internally, silence was no longer automatic. It was selected. Before, my quiet had been a habit, an instinct to keep things smooth. Now it was a filter. I listened differently. I paid attention not just to what was said, but to what wasn't. Who initiated conversations? Who avoided specifics? Who assumed continuity without confirming consent? And people did assume it. Plans continued to be discussed around me. Timelines were hinted at. Decisions edged closer to permanence. No one asked if I was still comfortable with the arrangement. No one checked whether my role was sustainable. They didn't need to. I'd trained them not to. What changed was my response. Not outwardly, but internally. I stopped filling in gaps prematurely. I stopped clarifying things that weren't directly addressed to me. I let silence sit longer than I used to. And almost immediately, I noticed something interesting. People mistook my restraint for compliance. When I didn't jump in to reassure, they assumed reassurance wasn't necessary. When I didn't volunteer to solve a problem, they assumed it wasn't urgent. The system was so used to my quiet intervention that it couldn't distinguish between presence and participation. That distinction mattered. There were moments when I could have spoken up, moments when a single sentence would have reasserted my position. I chose not to, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see how far assumptions would carry things without reinforcement. Silence, when chosen consciously, reveals more than confrontation ever could. I watched how quickly plans solidified when no one felt challenged. How confidently people spoke when they believed there would be no resistance. How rarely anyone circled back to verify understanding. It wasn't malicious, it was efficient. And efficiency, I was learning, doesn't include empathy unless it's required. I continued paying the property taxes, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to see the full shape of the system before altering it. I wanted data, not drama. Patterns, not emotions. Each payment was logged, each document filed, not as ammunition, but as context. People often assume silence means you've accepted the terms. What they don't realize is that silence can also mean you're still deciding. There was a quiet power in that realization. I no longer felt the urge to explain myself. I didn't need to be understood in the moment. Understanding, I realized, wasn't the same as leverage. And leverage doesn't announce itself. As weeks passed, the tone around the house grew more definitive. Language shifted from hypothetical to practical. Timelines became more concrete. References to when were replaced with if. Still, no one checked with me. That absence confirmed everything I needed to know. My silence, in their eyes, meant approval. In reality, it meant assessment. I was watching a structure reveal its dependencies without interference. What surprised me most was how comfortable I felt, not empowered in a dramatic way. Grounded, focused, detached from the emotional obligation I'd been carrying for years. For the first time, I wasn't managing anyone else's expectations. I was managing my own. Silence became a way to gather information without alerting anyone that the rules were about to change. It gave me space to think clearly, without being pulled into roles I no longer consented to. I hadn't made any moves yet. I hadn't withdrawn support. I hadn't drawn lines. But I had stopped automatically maintaining an arrangement that only worked because I never questioned it. That was the real shift. Because once silence becomes a choice, it stops being weakness. It becomes a position. What they never noticed wasn't something I did suddenly. It was something I had always done, just without intention. While everyone else spoke in generalities, I dealt in specifics. Dates, amounts, records, patterns. That had always been my nature. I liked clarity. I liked knowing exactly where things stood. For years, that tendency had been framed as diligence, quiet responsibility, nothing more. What no one realized was that consistency creates a trail. Every property tax payment had a receipt. Every receipt had a timestamp. Every timestamp told a story. Not a dramatic one, but a precise one. A record of who had carried the financial weight and for how long, without interruption. I hadn't been collecting these documents out of suspicion. I'd been collecting them out of habit, out of respect for order, out of a belief that being prepared was part of being responsible. Only now, with the distance my chosen silence gave me, did I see what that preparation actually meant. I began reviewing everything more deliberately, not emotionally, methodically. I laid out the documents across my desk, organizing them by year. I traced the continuity, the unbroken line of responsibility. No missed payments, no shared transfers, just consistency. It wasn't about proving anything yet. It was about understanding the full shape of my involvement. At the same time, I started paying attention to conversations more closely. Not just what was said, but what was assumed. I noticed how often phrases like "we'll handle it" appeared without any defined roles. How frequently my contribution was referenced indirectly, as if it belonged to the environment rather than to me. That's when I understood something subtle but important. My reliability had become a background condition, like heat in winter, essential but unnoticed until it stops. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't reassert myself. I let the assumptions remain intact, because assumptions reveal dependencies more honestly than negotiations do. While others moved forward emotionally, I moved laterally, into learning. I read, quietly, not forums or opinion pieces, but actual statutes, property tax law, contribution doctrines, how courts interpret long-term financial maintenance in family-owned assets, not with the goal of taking action, just to understand the landscape. Knowledge, I've learned, changes how you carry yourself long before it changes outcomes. The more I learned, the calmer I became. Not because I had found a weapon, but because I had found context. I could see where responsibility and authority were misaligned. I could see how informal arrangements survive on silence, not fairness. And I could see what happens when silence is withdrawn. I also began documenting conversations, not recordings, notes, dates. Who said what was implied, what was left unsaid. Again, not out of paranoia, but clarity. I wanted a complete picture, not just fragments filtered through memory. All of this happened without any outward signal. No one noticed a change in my demeanor. I didn't become distant or cold. I was still polite, still present, still predictable. That was important. People don't guard against what feels familiar. I continued my routines. I went to work. I returned calls. I attended family gatherings. I paid the taxes when they came due. On the surface, nothing had changed. Underneath, everything had. I wasn't preparing for conflict. I was preparing for certainty. There's a difference. Conflict reacts to behavior. Certainty responds to structure. What they never noticed was that while they were deciding what felt right, I was learning what was real. While they were speaking in narratives, I was reading frameworks. While they assumed continuity, I was mapping consequences. Not because I wanted control, but because I wanted to stop being blindsided. By the time I finished that quiet period of preparation, I wasn't anxious. I wasn't resentful. I wasn't eager to act. I was steady. I knew what I had contributed. I knew how it was documented. I knew what assumptions were being made and which ones were unsupported. Most importantly, I knew that whatever happened next wouldn't be improvised. They never noticed the preparation because it didn't look like preparation. It looked like the same old Scott. Organized, calm, helpful. They mistook familiarity for predictability. And that misunderstanding gave me the one thing I'd never had before in this situation: time. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no surge of triumph, no sense of victory. It arrived quietly, like a conclusion you reach after checking the same equation from every angle and realizing the answer doesn't change. I was alone when it happened. No witnesses, no dramatic timing, just me, my desk, and the documents I'd been living alongside for years. I had finished laying everything out, every payment, every date, every supporting record. I wasn't searching for justification anymore. I was confirming alignment, what I thought I'd contributed versus what the evidence actually showed. They matched. That was the moment of clarity. Not that I might have leverage, I could argue this, but this is real, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. For a long time, I'd treated my involvement as support, voluntary, flexible, rooted in goodwill. What I saw now was that it had crossed into something else entirely. Duration matters, consistency matters, intent matters less than impact. The law, unlike families, doesn't care about assumptions. It cares about patterns. And the pattern was unmistakable. Years of uninterrupted financial responsibility are tied directly to preserving the asset. No shared burden, no reimbursement, no formal agreement limiting my role to charity. Just a long, quiet line of contribution that told a very clear story to anyone trained to read it. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel grounded. Because for the first time, my understanding of the situation wasn't dependent on how anyone else framed it. I didn't need validation. I didn't need permission to see it clearly. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being sensitive. I wasn't overthinking. I was late to recognizing reality, but I had arrived. What struck me most was how neutral the truth felt once it was fully visible. There was no emotional charge left in it, just structure, cause and effect. If I continued as before, the outcome was predictable. If I changed one variable, the structure would respond accordingly. That's when I understood something else. I didn't need to convince anyone of anything. Convincing requires engagement. Engagement invites argument. Argument drags emotion back into a space where clarity had finally settled. I didn't want noise. I wanted inevitability. So I sat with the knowledge. I didn't rush to act. I let it integrate. For days, I went about my life exactly as before, carrying this new understanding quietly. It changed how I listened, how I interpreted the tone, how I weighed words. I wasn't waiting for the right moment to reveal anything because there was nothing to reveal yet. This wasn't about disclosure. It was about alignment. I also realized something uncomfortable. If I acted too early, it would look reactive, emotional, like a response to hurt. That framing would weaken the truth, even if the facts remained solid. Timing, I saw, was everything. The private reveal wasn't just about discovering leverage. It was about discovering restraint, about recognizing that the strongest position isn't the one you announce. It's the one you occupy without explanation. I reviewed the records one last time, not to reassure myself, but to close the loop. When I put them back into the folder, I didn't feel anticipation. I felt calm. Because the moment you truly understand your position, urgency disappears. You don't need to rush toward outcomes. You let outcomes come to you, shaped by decisions you've already made internally. I didn't change my behavior toward my parents. I didn't pull away. I didn't grow colder. There was no punishment in my silence. There was simply a shift in ownership of my attention, my effort, my future actions. They continued operating under the same assumptions. That continuity was important. It meant the system was still revealing itself honestly, without distortion. The private reveal wasn't a turning point that others could see. It was the point after which I would never again confuse responsibility with obligation or silence with surrender. I now knew exactly where I stood. And once you know that, the next decision isn't emotional. It's inevitable. Clarity changes the nature of choice. Before, every option felt blurred by emotion, loyalty, habit, fear of disruption. Now, those layers had fallen away. What remained were paths, distinct, unequal, each with consequences I could finally see without flinching. I didn't rush to decide. I mapped. One option was to continue as I had been. Say nothing. Pay quietly. Let the situation resolve itself the way others expected it to. That path promised surface harmony and internal erosion. I knew where it ended because I was already standing in its future. Another option was confrontation. Lay everything out. Receipts, records, feelings, demand acknowledgement, force a renegotiation of roles. That path offered validation, but at a cost. It would turn clarity into conflict. It would make the truth sound like an accusation, and it would allow others to reframe the situation as emotional rather than structural. There was a third option, subtler, slower, irreversible. It didn't require explaining myself. It didn't require permission. It didn't rely on anyone suddenly understanding my perspective. It required only that I stop participating in an arrangement that existed solely because I kept it alive. That option felt heavy, not because it was cruel, but because it was final. Once taken, there would be no returning to the old equilibrium. The system would adjust. People would feel the shift before they understood it. I sat with that weight longer than I expected. This wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. It wasn't about leverage or punishment. It was about alignment between what I was responsible for and what I was willing to carry. The question wasn't, what do they deserve? It was, what am I no longer willing to subsidize? That reframing changed everything. I realized that any choice I made would disappoint someone. There was no clean exit. The only question was whether I would continue disappointing myself to avoid that discomfort. Once I saw it that way, the decision wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, settled. I chose the path that didn't require explanation. I chose to withdraw support, not abruptly, not vindictively, but deliberately, in a way that respected reality rather than narrative. I would let deadlines exist, let responsibilities return to their actual holders, let assumptions encounter friction. I didn't announce this decision. I didn't warn anyone. Not because I wanted to surprise them, but because warning would invite negotiation, and negotiation would reopen the very dynamic I was exiting. This wasn't a conversation, it was a boundary. The moment I decided, something in me relaxed. Not relief, resolution. Like placing something heavy down after carrying it longer than you should have. I understood then why this option had felt irreversible, because it changed how I saw myself. I was no longer the person who absorbed imbalance for the sake of smoothness. I was someone who recognized when participation became self-erasure. That recognition couldn't be undone. I planned carefully, not to cause chaos, but to avoid it. I made sure I wasn't creating legal or financial harm. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was simply stepping out of a role that had never been formally mine. That distinction mattered to me. There was no timeline announced, no countdown, just a shift in how I would respond, or not respond, when the next moment arrived. And it would arrive. Systems always reveal their weak points when one element stops compensating for everyone else. I didn't feel anxious waiting for that moment. I felt ready, because the decision point wasn't about what would happen next. It was about who I had decided to stop being. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel the urge to act quickly. Speed would have looked emotional. I wanted the shift to feel natural, like gravity doing what gravity always does when support is removed. So I moved quietly. The first thing I did was nothing. No reminders, no check-ins, no proactive fixes. When conversations drifted toward the house, I listened without volunteering. When assumptions were voiced, I didn't correct them. I let statements stand on their own weight. People tend to reveal more when they think nothing has changed. Behind the scenes, I adjusted my own systems. I reviewed automatic payments. I marked upcoming deadlines, not to prepare to cover them, but to be aware of when they would arrive. Awareness without intervention is a powerful position. I also separated myself emotionally from outcomes I didn't control. That was harder than the logistics. For years, I'd been conditioned to feel responsible not just for tasks, but for consequences. If something went wrong, I felt it as a personal failure. Now I practiced restraint. Responsibility, I reminded myself, only exists where authority exists. Anything else is volunteer work disguised as obligation. Weeks passed, nothing happened at first. That didn't surprise me. Systems don't fail immediately when one person steps back. They coast on momentum, on habit, on the assumption that what has always worked will continue to work. That assumption was doing a lot of work for them. I noticed subtle signs of strain before anyone else did. A missed follow-up, a delayed response, a question that lingered longer than it used to. Small things, easy to ignore, until they weren't. Still, no one reached out to me directly. That silence confirmed my choice more than any confrontation could have. It told me that my role had never been relational. It had been functional. People don't check on functions. They check on people. I didn't feel bitter about that. I felt accurate. As the next tax deadline approached, I did what I'd always done. I reviewed the notice carefully. I verified the amount. I confirmed the due date. And then I stopped. I didn't cancel anything with fanfare. I didn't notify anyone of a change. I simply didn't step in to prevent the natural consequence of inattention. That moment wasn't satisfying. It wasn't tense. It was clean. I wasn't withholding something I'd promised. I was declining to continue something I'd never agreed to indefinitely. The day passed quietly. No calls, no messages. The system, for the moment, didn't notice the absence. But absence works differently from presence. Presence props things up. Absence exposes what was being held together. I continued my life as usual, went to work, paid my own bills, took care of my own responsibilities. I slept well, not because I felt vindicated, but because I wasn't split anymore. No part of me was secretly bracing for resentment or guilt. I had already processed those emotions before acting. What remained was steadiness. Eventually, the first ripple appeared, a casual comment, a note of confusion. Someone mentioned a notice they didn't expect. Not addressed to me, not yet, just floated into the family conversation like static. I listened. No accusation, no acknowledgement, just uncertainty. That uncertainty wasn't my problem to solve. Moving in silence meant resisting the urge to step back into familiarity, to reassure, to smooth things over. Those instincts didn't disappear, but I no longer obeyed them automatically. I was watching something recalibrate in real time. Not people's feelings, the structure itself. And the most important part was this: nothing I'd done could be framed as aggressive. There was no action to point to, no message to quote, no moment to dramatize. I had simply stopped compensating. And when compensation ends, reality begins. Consequences don't always arrive with impact. Sometimes they arrive in confusion. At first, it was subtle. A question was asked out loud, but not directed at anyone in particular. A pause in conversation where there used to be certainty. Someone mentioned a letter that must have been sent to the wrong address. I heard all of it. No one called me directly. No one asked if I knew what was going on. That wasn't an oversight. It was a habit. I had always been the silent fix, not the point of inquiry. But now, without my quiet intervention, small problems stopped disappearing. A deadline had been missed. Not catastrophically. Not yet. Just enough to introduce friction. The kind of friction that makes people uneasy, because it signals something they don't fully understand. I watched the unease spread slowly. What struck me most was how people responded to that discomfort, not by examining assumptions, but by searching for the old pattern, for the invisible hand that usually made these things go away. They didn't find it. The conversation changed tone. Where there had been confidence, there was now speculation. Where there had been momentum, there was hesitation. I stayed present, calm, unchanged. No one accused me of anything. That came later. At this stage, there was only a vague sense that something was off, and that was enough. When people are used to stability, even a minor disruption feels disproportionate. It forces awareness, not immediately, but inevitably. I noticed how often my name came up in third person. Scott usually handles this. Scott might know. Always framed as observation, not a request. No one asked me directly. I let that stand. There was a moment when I could have stepped in. Clarified, explained, reassured everyone that I'd take care of it. The path back into the role was still open. I didn't take it, because I knew what stepping back in would mean. It wouldn't be gratitude, it would be a relief, and relief would reset the system exactly as it was. The next consequence came not as a problem, but as a reaction. Tension, not anger, not blame. Just a subtle edge in conversations. Shorter sentences, less certainty. People don't like ambiguity, especially when they didn't know they were relying on someone to prevent it. The house, which had once been discussed with ease, became a source of low-level stress. Not enough to trigger action, but enough to change the emotional temperature. That change was important. It showed me that the structure had depended on my silence more than anyone realized. Not because I was indispensable, but because I had been predictable. Predictability creates comfort. Comfort creates dependence. I wasn't enjoying this. I wasn't observing with satisfaction. I was simply watching a process unfold that had been set in motion long before I made any decision. I reminded myself of that often. This wasn't something I was doing to them. It was something I had stopped doing for them. That distinction mattered. Eventually, someone asked a general question. Has anyone been keeping track of this? The tone wasn't accusatory. It was anxious, uncertain. I didn't answer, not because I wanted to be withholding, but because the question wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to the room, to the system. And the system, without my intervention, had no answer. That silence felt different than the ones before. It wasn't empty. It was heavy. For the first time, people were experiencing the absence of a role they had never consciously acknowledged. They were feeling the cost of assumptions without yet understanding their source. I stayed steady, polite, available in every way except the one that would reset everything. The consequences had begun, not as punishment, not as collapse, but as awareness. And awareness, once introduced, doesn't retreat easily. The moment panic enters a system, it doesn't announce itself loudly. It leaks. It shows up as urgency without clarity. The questions were asked too late, as a sudden desire to talk things through that would have been unnecessary months earlier. That's when I knew the window had closed. The conversations shifted again. Not vague anymore, reactive. People began retracing steps, asking how things had fallen through the cracks. There was confusion about responsibilities that had never been defined, frustration about tasks no one remembered assigning, and underneath all of it, a quiet realization. Something that used to work no longer did. That realization made people uncomfortable. I could feel the change in tone when my name came up. Not accusatory, not yet, but searching, as if they were trying to locate the missing piece without admitting it had ever existed. Eventually, someone reached out to me directly, not with accountability, with urgency. The message wasn't framed as an apology or a question about my role. It was framed as a problem that needed solving, quickly. A subtle expectation that I would step back in, because that's what I had always done. I read it carefully, twice, and I didn't respond right away. That pause mattered more than any answer could have, because by the time the message arrived, the structure had already shifted. Deadlines had passed. Options had narrowed. What could have been adjusted calmly weeks earlier now required scrambling. That's the cost of delayed awareness. When people finally look up, they assume the fix is still available. They don't realize that timing is part of the solution. When I did respond, my tone was unchanged. Calm, respectful, clear. I didn't accuse, I didn't explain myself emotionally. I simply asked a clarifying question in return, one that exposed the assumption beneath the urgency. The response was silence. That silence told me everything. It wasn't that they didn't know what to say. It was that they were realizing, in real time, that they didn't have the authority they thought they did, and that the person they had relied on had never formally agreed to that role. Panic doesn't always look like fear. Sometimes it looks like bargaining. There were suggestions, adjustments. Last-minute ideas floated as if they might rewind time. None of them addressed the core issue. They were attempts to restore equilibrium without acknowledging what had changed. But equilibrium doesn't return just because people want it to. At this point, even if I had wanted to step back in, it wouldn't have solved the problem. The system was already reacting to its own gaps. Consequences were unfolding independently of my involvement. That's what made it irreversible. Not my decision, but the delay in recognizing it. I felt no satisfaction watching this happen. I felt distance. The kind that comes when you realize you're no longer inside a dynamic. You're observing it. The emotional pull that used to guide my actions wasn't there anymore. I wasn't trying to be understood. I wasn't trying to be fair. I was being accurate. Accuracy isn't comforting, but it is stabilizing. Eventually, the tone changed again. Less urgency, more restraint. People began adjusting their expectations, not outwardly, but internally. You could hear it in the way sentences softened, in how plans were reframed. The realization had landed. Whatever safety net they assumed was there, wasn't. And it hadn't disappeared overnight. It had simply stopped being automatic. By the time anyone wanted to fix it, the fix would have required going back to the beginning, acknowledging roles, responsibilities, and contributions that had been ignored for years. No one wanted that conversation, so instead they adjusted around the absence. That was the final shift. Not reconciliation, not resolution, acceptance. And acceptance always comes after regret. Quietly, reluctantly, without ceremony. By then, nothing could be reversed. Not because I refused, but because the truth had finally surfaced. And truth doesn't retreat once it's exposed. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like what people imagine when they hear that word. There was no raised voice, no rehearsed speech, no emotional unloading of years of frustration. It happened quietly, almost reluctantly, in the aftermath of everything that had already shifted. By then, the urgency had burned itself out. We were sitting in the same room we'd sat in countless times before. Same chairs, same familiar patterns. The difference was that no one was pretending anymore. Not about the situation, and not about me. Someone finally said my name directly, not to ask for help, to ask for clarity. That distinction mattered. I listened first. I always had. They spoke about confusion, about how things had gotten complicated, about how no one realized certain responsibilities weren't clearly defined. The language was careful, defensive, but restrained. No one wanted to accuse. No one wanted to apologize either. I let them finish. When I spoke, I did not bring out documents. I didn't list dates or amounts. I didn't narrate my internal journey. None of that was necessary. I kept it simple. I said I had handled the property taxes for years because it seemed necessary at the time. I said I had never agreed to carry that responsibility indefinitely. And I said that when decisions began moving forward without my involvement, I reassessed what I was willing to continue doing. No blame, no tone, just sequence. There was a pause after that. Not awkward, processing. Someone asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. It was a fair question. I answered honestly, without accusation. I said I didn't realize silence had turned into expectation until it already had. And once I did, I needed to step back rather than argue forward. That answer didn't satisfy anyone emotionally, but it made sense structurally. And structure was all that was left. What surprised me was how little I felt in that moment. No anger, no vindication, no desire to be understood beyond what was necessary. I wasn't trying to win the conversation. I was closing it. There were no apologies offered. There were no demands made. Just a quiet recognition that something fundamental had changed, and that it couldn't be undone by explanation. The house came up, briefly, carefully, as if everyone was aware now that it wasn't just an emotional symbol, but a logistical reality with consequences. I didn't offer solutions, not because I didn't have them, but because offering them would have reopened the old dynamic, the one where I absorbed complexity so others didn't have to. That role was over. When the conversation ended, it didn't feel resolved. It felt complete. Completion doesn't require agreement. It requires understanding the limits of what can be changed. As I left, no one stopped me. No one asked for reassurance. The absence of that expectation told me everything I needed to know. The confrontation hadn't been about assigning fault. It had been about acknowledging reality, late, but fully. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was walking away from something fragile. I felt like I was walking forward without weight. After everything settled, people expected a transformation. Distance, bitterness, a colder version of me. That's usually how these stories go. That isn't what happened. What changed wasn't my personality, it was my posture. I didn't become harder, I became clearer. I still value responsibility. I still show up on time. I still keep my life organized. Those things were never the problem. The problem was believing that responsibility required invisibility, that being dependable meant being silent. Now, I don't confuse the two. I'm still calm in conversations, but my calm has edges, not sharp ones, defined ones. I ask questions when decisions affect me. I clarify roles before stepping in. I don't assume alignment where it hasn't been stated. That shift hasn't made me less generous. It's made me precise. What surprised me most was how natural it felt once I allowed it. Like using a muscle I'd avoided, not because it was weak, but because I didn't want to seem difficult. Boundaries, I learned, aren't declarations. They're habits. I didn't cut anyone off. I didn't rewrite history. I didn't demand acknowledgement for the past. I let it stand as it was, documented, understood, complete. That was enough. My relationship with my parents didn't collapse. It changed shape. Fewer assumptions, less drift, more directness. It isn't warmer, but it's honest. And honesty, I've found, is a better foundation than comfort built on silence. The house is no longer a symbol in my life. It's just an asset I'm not responsible for. That distinction alone lifted more weight than I expected. I hadn't realized how much mental space it occupied until it was gone. I also noticed something else. When I stopped compensating for others, they adjusted. Not perfectly, not immediately, but they did. People are more capable than we think, until we make it unnecessary for them to be. I no longer feel the need to be the quiet solution in the room. If something isn't mine to carry, I let it be visible. Not out of spite, but accuracy. Accuracy is respect for reality. I've carried this approach into other areas of my life. Work, friendships, even my own expectations of myself. I ask fewer should I questions and more, is this mine ones? That single shift has changed how I move through the world. I don't measure my worth by how little trouble I cause. I measure it by how aligned my actions are with my values. Calm doesn't mean passive. Kind doesn't mean silent. Reliable doesn't mean expendable. Those distinctions didn't come from confrontation or conflict. They came from stepping out of a role I never consciously agreed to play. And once you do that, you don't feel the need to announce who you've become. People can see it in how you stand. There's a temptation when a story like this ends to look for villains, to assign blame, to decide who was right and who was wrong. That's not the lesson I took from what happened. What I learned is quieter and more uncomfortable. Most harm doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from convenience. From unexamined patterns that work well enough for some people, no one stops to question who's carrying the weight. I wasn't betrayed in a dramatic way. I wasn't lied to. I wasn't pushed aside with hostility. I was relied on, without being recognized. And for a long time, I participated in that dynamic because it felt easier than challenging it. That part matters, because if I'm honest, no one could have taken advantage of my silence if I hadn't first offered it as a substitute for clarity. That doesn't make what happened fair, but it makes it understandable. The real cost wasn't financial. It was the slow erosion of agency. The way responsibility, when left undefined, turns into expectation. The way expectation, when left unchallenged, turns into entitlement. And the hardest truth I had to accept was this. People don't wake up one day and decide to stop respecting you. They adjust to the version of you that never asks to be considered. That adjustment isn't malicious, it's human. The solution, I learned, isn't confrontation for its own sake. It isn't proving your worth louder, and it isn't waiting for someone else to notice your sacrifice. It's alignment. Alignment between what you give and what you're willing to give. Between what you carry and what you've agreed to carry. Between silence as peace and silence as avoidance. When I stopped compensating for assumptions, reality didn't collapse. It clarified. Things became harder in the short term and healthier in the long term. That's the trade most of us avoid until we can't anymore. I don't tell this story to suggest that everyone should withdraw or go quiet. I tell it to remind you that boundaries don't require drama to be real, and that the calmest shifts are often the most permanent. If you're the dependable one in your family, your workplace, or your relationships, ask yourself this: are you choosing that role or maintaining it out of habit? And if you stopped filling in the gaps tomorrow, would people miss you or just the function you perform? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Have you ever realized too late that your silence was being mistaken for agreement?